at the Al-Aqsa University in the Gaza Strip. We are joined by Professor Haider Eid. Against the background of the United Arab Emirates, their cabinet has approved the establishment of an embassy in Tel Aviv in Israel. And at the same time, we have heard of the Israeli announcement talking about the opening of its embassy in Abu Dhabi. Professor Haider Eid, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh and welcome. Professor Eid, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Yes,
Thank you.
Yes, I can hear you. Obviously, there is a slight,
good.
there's slight distortion
Yeah.
on the line. But we want to talk about this latest news that's come out. The UAE cabinet that has approved the establishment of an embassy in Tel Aviv. At the same time, Israel announcing the opening of its embassy in Abu Dhabi. Just your reaction, your thoughts to this latest announcements that have been made.
Okay, thank you, Anayat, for having me on your show. Well, my reaction is the reaction of all Palestinian civil society sectors and political forces here in Palestine. All political forces and civil society sectors have already condemned the process of normalization that has been taking place between some Arab countries and in particular the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan and Morocco and apartheid Israel. The way we look at it is exactly the same way you people of South Africa considered any kind of quote-unquote normal relations between the apartheid system of South Africa and any other African country as a stab in the back of the blacks of South Africa. This is how we look at it. We think that this is a stab in the back of the Palestinian people. It's a form of treason, and it comes in violation of the BDS guidelines and the BDS call our civil society sectors came up with in 2005, in which we called on the international community in general and the Arab world in particular to boycott apartheid Israel, divest from it, and from companies benefiting from its occupation of Palestine, and impose sanctions against it. Unfortunately, what the United Arab Emirates has done is not only a form of normalization, it has become more complicit in Israel war crimes, in the sense that the United Arab Emirates, has decided to import, Israeli products from Israeli settlements. And everybody knows that settlements are a form of war crimes committed by apartheid Israel, condemned under international law, condemned by the United Nations and Security Council. And unfortunately, the United Arab Emirates has decided to go ahead with that. But to add insult to injury, the problem is that, you never wanted, in South Africa, you never wanted to see the flag of the apartheid regime flying in the skies of any other country, but in particular African countries and third world countries. And this is why we feel that we are being stabbed in the back by our own brothers.
Yes. Now, Professor Eid, this raises question marks because, you said stabbed in the back by your own brothers. And can we really call them your own brothers when they display the type of hypocrisy? And for far too long, the UAE, there have been huge question marks with regards to where their loyalties lie. And even before these agreements were signed, even before these announcements were made with regard to the embassies, there were always question marks whether they really cared about the Palestinians, whether they really cared about the Palestinian cause.
This is a very good point that you are making, Inayat. In fact, we distinguish between, governments and the peoples of the Arab world. The problem is that, our own leadership, in a way, has legitimized all forms of normalization with apartheid Israel by signing the Oslo Accords in 1993. Our leadership, opened the door wide for all Arab governments to normalize ties with apartheid Israel. But also you need to remember that we do not bank on those Arab governments and sheikhs of the Gulf states. What bank on is the will of the Arab people. According to the latest surveys here in the Arab world, 88% of Arabs from Morocco to Qatar are opposed to any form of normalization, normal ties with apartheid Israel. And yes, I agree with you. Actually, our problem is that we have naively believed that those Arab governments are our own brothers. But unfortunately, what we have ended up with is a form of an alliance between those reactionary Arab regimes and the state of Israel, taking also into consideration, Inayat, that Israel right now has the most fascist government in the history of the state of Israel. In other words, what you have an alliance between extreme right-wing fascists ruling apartheid Israel and also extreme right-wings ruling the Arab world. Those rulers have led the counter-revolutions against the Arab Spring. They are opposed to all forms of democracy, to all forms of transparency, and they have ended up creating a new enemy in the form of what they call the Shiite enemy, represented, of course, by Iran. And instead of supporting, democracy in the Arab world and supporting the struggle of the Palestinian people to regain their basic rights guaranteed under international law, they have decided to stand on the wrong side of history.
Well, certainly, and also I think interesting that you mentioned, Professor Haider Eid, about the Arab Spring. And yesterday we spoke briefly about the anniversary of the Arab Spring, and particularly what had taken place in Egypt. And one of the points that came out of discussion was obviously the neutralization of the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, but also the role that the Arab countries had played in supporting Egypt in getting rid, obviously, or neutralizing the Ikhwan. And we know what has happened to Mohammed Morsi. And in fact, even more brutal oppression is taking place in parts of the Arab world, in countries like Egypt, for instance. And also, we know that countries like the UAE that rule with an iron fist, and also in terms of Saudi Arabia as well.
That's absolutely correct. The thing is that the counter-revolution was led by the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, because the Arab Spring, in fact, which represented the hopes not only of Muslim brothers, in fact, which represented the hopes of all Arab peoples, as I said, from Morocco to Qatar. People wanted freedom. People wanted democracy. People wanted social justice. And those slogans, freedom, social justice, bread, etc., etc., and in fact, constituted a form of, an existential threat to the rule of the ruling monarchies in the Gulf and the dictators of the rest of the Arab world. And this is why they decided to have that kind of alliance with apartheid Israel. But we also need to remember, Inayat, that any form of democracy in the Arab world also constitutes a form of an existential and strategic threat to the state of Israel itself, because Israel has been selling the myth, the lie that it is, quote unquote, the only democracy, in the Middle East. And here you have Arab peoples fighting for democracy, voting for their own representatives in the Arab world, from Egypt, from Egypt to Sudan to Bahrain. And if the Arab Spring had succeeded, Had it succeeded, that would have actually, destroyed the Israeli myth that Israel has been selling to the international community. Israel has been committing crimes against humanity and war crimes in Palestine, but has been beautifying these crimes by claiming that it is the only democracy in the Middle East. The Arab Spring came to threaten that facade, and this is why Israel decided to support all those counter-revolutions in the Arab world.
Just finally, Professor Haider Eid, looking at this latest development, does this mean anything for the UAE-Palestinian relationship?
Sorry, I missed you here. And I come again.
What does this latest announcement about the embassies being opened in both Tel Aviv and Abu Dhabi, what does this mean for the UAE-Palestine relationship, or has there ever been a relationship between the UAE and Palestine?
Yeah. Well, the relationship between, most Arab countries and Palestine have been good in a way. But unfortunately, what this particular, normalization process means to us Palestinians is, is a delay in the process of liberation. Delay in our freedom from, occupation, apartheid, and settler colonialism in time. Notice, as I said, Israel has been, implementing a form of multi-tiered system of oppression against the Palestinian people, from direct military occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank to apartheid in Palestine, 1948, to settler colonialism, and a process of ethnic cleansing, an ongoing process of ethnic cleansing that has been taking place since 1948. What this basically, means is that the United Arab Emirates has decided to support all those forms of oppression against the Palestinian people. But I also need to remind you, Anayat, and your listeners, that when the United Arab Emirates decided to sign that normalization deal with apartheid Israel, the official Palestinian position was to sever all diplomatic ties with the United Arab Emirates and withdraw the Palestinian ambassador to Ramallah. And unfortunately, 2 weeks after doing that, the Palestinian Authority decided to send the ambassador back to Abu Dhabi, trying to restore those diplomatic ties with the United Arab Emirates, in a process, in a way, trying to appease the monarchy of the United Arab Emirates. And we know very well that the UAE has been supporting Mohammed Dahlan, for example, who is competing in a way with the president of the Palestinian Authority to regain Gaza and start a new process of, elections that we are supposed to have in May, supported by the United Arab Emirates, and replacing the president of the Palestinian Authority.
Well, Professor Eid, as always, we thank you. We say Jazakallah khairan to you for your time with us here on Salam Media, for coming on and talking to us this morning. We wish you all the best. Inshallah, Allah keep you safe. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you. Thank you.
Osman's Taj Mahal Spice and Rice. For over 80 years, Osman's Taj